Hi, poets. We have talked a lot about creating poems, getting feedback on poems, revising poems, starting to polish your work for publication. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can send out individual poems for publication in our next video. But I wanted to take a moment to talk about what do you do when you have a bunch of poems. You've been through a prolific writing time, perhaps taking a course like this or a workshop, or you had some time set aside and you've got 16 or more poems ready to share with the world. Today we're going to talk about how you can prepare a collection of poetry. We're going to start first with defining what a collection is. Whether you're doing a full length or a chapbook, we'll explore different ways to title your books, organize your books or their structure, as well as some design tips as you're putting together your poetry manuscript, and also how you can consider the best strategies for the poems you've written in this course. Before we get started, I definitely recommend that you grab a writing utensil and a piece of paper, post-it note, cocktail napkin, whatever you have handy, and make some notes on what you think would be good for you to do during this presentation, because I'm going to be showing you a lot of different options, different suggestions, and probably you're going to start brainstorming in your head. So make sure you get that down on the page so that you don't miss out on the excellent ideas that first come to mind as you start to dive into all of this stuff. So first we have chapbooks. Chapbooks are small. They have a long history, really since the start of the printing press. Chapbooks have been made to distribute different types of information to people. Chapbooks are small. I'm going to hold up a couple. If you notice, they're very slender. And chapbooks can be thought of in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they focus in on a particular topic and give you a deep dive into that particular thing, be it from a particular perspective, an exploration of a theme, those sorts of things. Sometimes it can also be a collection of poems like this one, where you are putting together a variety of poems, maybe poems that don't quite fit into a full-length collection, but you still love them and you want to share them with people. Sometimes chapbooks are produced by presses that really focus on the art of the chapbook. They might be handcrafted, they might be limited edition. You can notice the beautiful chapbook sitting up on the page here. Sometimes they, have incredible paper. They might only print 60, 100, and they're really works of art. And then other times you'll have poems that are bound much more like soft cover books, paperbacks that are going to go out perhaps to a wider audience with a larger publisher. Sometimes they are one poem, right? A poem that might be 16 to 24 pages. Other times they are, poems set consecutively. Other times they might be sectioned. And sometimes a chapbook ends up being a part of a larger collection of poetry. So full-length collections are often starting about 50 pages. And I'll show you some spine. These are a lot heftier. This one in particular is kind of a retrospective of this particular poet's work. But when you're looking at a full length, there's definitely a big difference in spaces. Sometimes, you might have 58 pages. Sometimes you might have 130. And so you'll want to pay attention to the publishers that you're submitting your work to see what they're asking for, what they can accommodate, etc. Full-length collections do the same things that chapbooks do, where you might be getting a story, you might be getting different types of poems, different perspectives included in the collection. And we're going to be taking a look at some examples in just a few moments. The first thing that you want to do before you start putting a book together is set your intention. So decide, what is your goal in putting all of these poems together? Are you just excited and you just want to take the plunge and put together your first book? Because I will tell you that the more you put together, the better you will probably get at it, the more efficient that process will become for you. Although I will say every book is unique and presents its own challenges. Um, as you start the process, think about what is it you hope to communicate. Is this kind of a greatest hits? You're showing off your best work. Are you trying to tell a story? Are you trying to elicit a particular set of emotions from your readers? Having a goal in mind or an intention set will help you make decisions during the process about what you want to do. You can also borrow what you already know from all of the fiction that you've read, right? Thinking about ordering a collection in the same way that you might think about writing a short story or a novel or putting together story collection. You can be thinking about exposition or backstory, poems that present the catalyst, like what's happened that's kind of setting off this particular rumination or emotional journey, or perhaps story narrative in the set of poems. Thinking about different poems as having different moments in the rising action. There might be a climax, a poem that kind of lets us know that this is the moment of crisis for the speaker in the poem. And then the poems that follow that provide some sort of resolution in a way. So you can definitely take everything you know as your experience as a reader and pull that into your process as you're trying to make decisions about the reader experience you want to create for the people looking at your work. It's also important to make sure that you're flexible. Be open to shuffling and reshuffling and revisiting and putting things in and taking things out. It is a messy process. And make sure that you're taking good records during this as well. Before you get in and start making a bunch of changes to your manuscript, resave it so you have that old version that you can come back to as a record and say, I don't know, I like that better, but what was it I did? Keeping a file that has working titles in it or different ideas you have for covers as they come up. So keeping good records is going to help you preserve your process so that you can go back and revisit ideas if they were discarded and you regret doing that. When you're getting started, especially putting together your first book, you want to think about what your path is. And so I'm going to start with kind of two paths that I've noticed emerging writers start down as they're putting together their first collection. When you look at the poems that you've written, and I recommend the first thing you do is kind of sit down and read through everything, you're going to perhaps see that you have a strong narrative. When you put all of your poems together, they're telling some sort of story about someone, right? It might be about a relationship. It could be about something that happened to the speaker in the poem. If you put them together, it might be, oh, well, all of these poems together kind of tell the story of someone growing up or somebody navigating a pandemic or these different things. And so you might see a strong narrative happen or some sort of journey toward growth or new understanding. You might be working towards a revelation. And if that's the case, you might want to take a path where you're organizing along that narrative timeline, whether it's linear, kind of follows, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, or nonlinear, where, okay, this is happening, but now I remember back to when this happened, and now let me jump forward to the next thing, and I'm going to come back to where we were. But following that story can help you make decisions about the way you'd like to structure your book. Or you might realize, I'm not telling any sort of a story here. I picked these three abstract pieces of art because to me, I find that I have an emotional response to all of them, and I have a different emotional response to all of them. So I'd like you to kind of look at those and see, how do you feel when you look at these different works of art? What are the stories that kind of come up in your head? What emotions do you feel in response to them? Well, you can do the same type of thing with your poems. So instead of following a narrative arc or developing a story through your poems, what you can think about is the emotional responses that your readers are going to have to your poems, and use that emotional kind of up and down as your guide. So this is for folks when you read through all of your poem and you realize, ooh, I have a huge variety of topics and forms and speakers and different perspectives because I've been working off of writing prompts and I didn't sit down with the intention to write this particular life story. There's not a clear sense of a timeline, and so they're kind of all over the place. And perhaps that is a great strength, that in showing this diversity in the poems, they are coming together to produce something that's pretty cool. So I kind of think of this as the greatest hits album, or putting together a playlist for someone, where again, rather than following a storyline, what you're doing is thinking about, okay, what's the vibe? Like, how am I going to ease people into this? And then how am I going to kind of raise the tension or raise the level of excitement? And how long am I going to sustain that before I kind of bring people back down again? So just like you would put together a playlist, or in my day, a mixtape for somebody that you care about for a particular occasion, you're putting that same type of thought into the order of your poems for your readers. Another thing that you're going to have to do is decide what's in and what's out. What is making the cut in the current manuscript? And this is absolutely personal. I've had poems go into a manuscript, then I've taken it back out, and then I put it back in. And it comes back to that intention. So if you're committing to a particular kind of emotional wave, and you realize, wow, I have 5 poems that kind of have the same feeling to them, and I can only work in 3 of those moments, and then it becomes redundant or repetitive. Well, you might pick your best 3 out of the 5 and save those other 2 to send off individually to magazines, or maybe they're going to become part of another collection. If it feels like the poem was just an exercise or a practice, you did it, you grew as a poet, but it's not something that you're really proud of, it doesn't really fit into the other things that you're putting together, I would set it aside. If it's a poem that's not yet communicating the message you want it to send, it might maybe make the cut. If you're not in love with the poem, it might maybe make the cut. It could be that you flag it for continued revision as you put together your project, or set it aside, put it in the closed drawer, and come back to it a little bit later. We're going to take a look now at some different books. The books that I'm sharing with you, actually, I have all sitting in front of me. These are all books that I have read, I know well, I enjoy many of them. I know the poets who wrote them. And these have all been books that have significantly impacted my personal journey as a poet. I can't tell you how incredibly hard it was to pick the books for these examples, because there are so many to choose from. But I hope that this representative sample is helpful to you. And if there's one that interests you, I recommend writing down the title of the book, the poet's name, and you can absolutely find all of these online and check them out and see what they look like on the inside as well. So one way you can approach a collection is through form. And I think Victoria Chang's book, Obit, this is a full-length collection, is a wonderful example of this. In her book, she has 3 sections, and 2 of the sections are obituaries. She's writing about the death of her mother, the stroke her father had, and her processing of that during midlife, and how it's affecting her and her family and her relationship with her father moving forward. If you notice in the cover here, she has that feeling of the obituary page, but it's her own obituary that she's written in the book, and her photo. And the poems that are obituaries in the collection are all formatted in that prose format, with the thin column. So we're being introduced in the cover and title here to the form that's being used throughout. So for example, if you are putting together 18 sonnets, right, that may inform what it is you want to do on your cover. And if you're looking at this, I hope you're also taking in that the cover is very upfront with what the form is. These are obituaries. It is going to talk about death and loss, grieving. And so I think it's a great example of that as well. You can also put together your book in terms of a narrative frame. And I selected this book, A School for Fishermen by Carlo Matos, for that reason. In this book, he has multiple personas or characters who are all united through a family, multi-generational, and the different sections in the book come from the perspectives of those different family members, and they all kind of navigate around this history in the family of fishermen, and also what they're learning during their lifetime and how that is being played out intergenerationally as we as readers get to hear about these people's lives and draw our own connections between them. Now, you might be asking yourself on the cover there, why a rooster? Why not a boat, perhaps, or the picture of a school? So in this particular cover, as we're getting our visual welcome into the poem, a rooster is displayed, and that is an image and a metaphor that comes up throughout the poems in each one of the sections. So that is a unifying image throughout the book. And so in my mind, that's on the cover to give me a visual heads up to let me know that's something that I want to be paying attention to as I start to notice roosters pop up throughout the book. You can also put together your collection if you're focusing on a particular person or timeline, like you would a narrative. You might be kind of starting with the beginning of something and moving through towards the end of something and show us what that person learns. So this is a book by Adrian Matika called The Big Smoke. And these are all persona poems from the point of view of the famous boxer Jack Johnson. So this book's organizational structure is based on his life and his experiences, not only in boxing, but the civil rights movement and his personal life as well. And Mr. Matika put in a lot of time researching Mr. Johnson's life, and there are notes in the back of the book that share those resources with us. The title of this particular collection focuses on the nickname of Mr. Johnson, the boxer, so the Big Smoke. And the image on this cover gives us an illustration of him in his fighting stance. And so we know right away that this will have something to do with the Big Smoke, with the boxer Jack Johnson. And as we dive into the collection, then our expectations are met. Another example of focusing on a character persona, this time not a real person, right? Mr. Matika did like a biography, right? He researched the life of another person. Well, in this book, Tina by Peter Davis, he focuses on a character named Tina, and the speaker in the book keeps talking throughout the poems to Tina, a character that Mr. Davis made up. I've had a conversation with Peter Davis, and the idea of the character Tina did stem from a newspaper article that he read about a woman in his hometown, but this is fictionalized. You'll also sometimes have a persona where the speaker in the poem is someone else. And so that could be a way to identify for your readers what that object, persona, character is through titling your book. This is also an example of, rather than using a photograph or an illustration, you can use text to create your cover design. And I'm also showing you the back here because there's a little bit of echoing, right? We have that background cover of the horizon repeated on the back of the book, and then the letters rearranged in another way. Another way that you can arrange your collection is through the voice of your speaker. So you've been writing about yourself, all the poems are coming from your perspective, but they are about a lot of different things. There's no real thread that you can necessarily say, well, here's a timeline or here's a sense of a narrative. This is just a bunch of stuff I care about, I wonder about, I think about. And so you could choose to title your work, organize your work through that voice. This is a collection called Voice by Allison Joseph. She shared with me that these were all poems that she loved that just were not making it into full-length collections. So she decided she wanted to honor them, and she put them into their own chapbook collection. And so here's an example of kind of using that unifying voice to put together the poems that you love in an order that might probably follow that playlist philosophy, where you're creating an interesting experience for your readers that's not telling a specific story to them. And here's an example of using art that exists from other people on the cover of your book. Here is another example of an image from the collection being used to title the collection. So here we have The Wedding Stone by Taylor Malley. I read in an interview following his work that this is a collection that was written 10 plus years, and all of the poems in this book centered on Mr. Malley's wife's suicide, and they were being written throughout his life, but the timing, right, they just were never fitting into other books that he was putting together. And he finally realized that this needed to be its own collection, and that what was most appropriate for him and his work at the time was to put it into the chapbook format. So this is a small sliver of his wife and his story. So here we have the wedding stone. That's an image that comes up, and that's something that you would use to sharpen a knife. And then we also have a hand illustration of a wedding cake, because this book is centering on this married couple's experiences. And so we kind of have those two things that play with each other. And so if you are thinking about using an image, you could have the image on the cover also represent that as well. You can certainly use your own art to create your cover too. Metaphor is another way to go when you think about titling your collection. In this full-length collection by Lori Clements Lambeth, Veil and Fern, she is talking about her diagnosis with MS, and she's also talking about her marriage to her husband. And so we have this image of the veil kind of standing in for that relationship. In this, we have a fuzzy picture of the wedding dress that she wore, kind of highlighted in the dark. And then we also have burn, which is standing in for all of those symptoms that she was experiencing at the time of her wedding and moving forward as she and her husband were starting their life together. So you can go with metaphor for your cover, pull it out from what you have already established in perhaps an individual poem, or pulling from one that's popping up in several different poems, or coming up with one that you feel is appropriate for the message you're trying to send in your book. You can also go with a poem title in the collection. So the book, Maybe the Saddest Thing by Marcus Whitaker, the poem, Maybe the Saddest Thing, appears in the book. So he pulled out one poem to highlight. I think this is also a fun illustration of a way you could do your cover. Here we have a collage made out of a lot of the different pop culture references that Mr. Whitaker is making throughout his book. And so this is something that you could do as well if you want to pull out a poem that you feel is kind of a touchstone, or kind of announces like, hey, this is kind of what the book is about. And other poems are then in conversation with that. And you can also come up with a collage of different images, things, ideas that might be related to your book, that people can kind of get an inkling for what's going to come inside. This is another example of a very different way of presenting the poem titles. So this is a book called Quilting the Black Eyed Pea by Nikki Giovanni. This is a collection that is spanning kind of the course of her poetic career. So this is pulling from different books, different decades, and coming together in a much larger collection. And so I really enjoy that she selected Quilting the Black Eyed Pea because I like the idea of quilting and putting together all of these different poems and moments in her life to kind of come together and be a retrospective and introduce us to and celebrate her work as a poet. She also has herself on the cover of her book. So that's something that you could do as well. If you are the speaker in all of the poems and you want to introduce people to you and you're talking about yourself, that could be another way that you go with your cover. You can take a line from a poem. So rather than taking a poem's title, you can pull one line from one of the poems. And here we have The Open Mouth of the Vase by Amy Ash. And that's coming from one of her poems. And I also think that this is a really interesting cover as well. She told me that this is actually the picture of a woman dancing in this voluptuous dress. And so this doesn't have anything to do with a vase, but she did feel that it evoked the feeling that she wanted to get people to feel when they're thinking about this visual space of the open mouth of a vase and this softness that's going to then pull us into the collection. You might also have a book that is an entire poem. So this is Book of Lake, and you'll notice it's called A Poem. This is by Nicholas Gulick, and the entire book is just one poem. So we don't have a table of contents, we don't have multiple titles. This is it. And so if this is the direction you want to go in, then whatever you're titling your poem would be the title of your book. And I also wanted to share the back cover here because this is an interesting wraparound. Rather than going with, say, a photograph of a lake, instead, the design of this cover presents us with an abstract image. And when we open up the cover, I can even do it for here right now, right? We get this circle that presents a lot of different images, not only perhaps of a lake, but of a boundary, of the cells in a body. And so going with something that is abstract and suggests maybe quite a few different ideas might be a way that you want to welcome readers into your experience. And this is also another chapbook that is one poem. So The Astronaut's Apprentice is one poem. It's coming from the perspective of a young woman who is talking to someone else. And this, I think, is a great illustration of a cover that is pulling a bunch of different images and moments from the book and presenting them to us at the very start. So we're getting these images, and as we start to learn the story of this young woman who is babysitting, right, we're going to come back to these different images and be like, oh yeah. And this is also another great illustration of what you could choose to draw if you have those skills. So quick review, we just covered a ton of information, and I hope you took some notes on the different things that were exciting to you. When you're thinking about your cover, you're thinking about it as your visual welcome. It's often the first thing that will catch people's eyes, be it on Amazon, right? Be it on a bookshelf somewhere, sitting on somebody's table, if you have it for your profile picture in your social media or something like that. So whatever you're doing with your cover, you want to make sure it is a welcome, an invitation to readers, that it's setting some sort of expectation that the book will be in communication with. Sometimes leaving people a little intrigued as well can get them interested in diving into the book as quickly as possible. When you're thinking about titles, again, some of the strategies that we just reviewed were using the form, telling us what the story is about, sharing a focal point or an object from the book, letting us know the voice, the persona, the person or character that the book is about, sharing an image from the book, a metaphor from the book, using a poem's title, using a line from a poem, or if the entire chapbook is one poem, just letting that poem's title be the book's title. I do recommend that you keep a list of all the title ideas that you come up with, because one day it sounds awesome and the next day you think, what was I thinking? So coming up with all of the options, saving that list and coming back to it, trying on different things, especially maybe getting different readers to check it out with different titles, can help you figure out what is the one that you want to keep, at least for now, as you start sharing it more widely with people. That structure as well can be informed by all of the things we just talked about. It may be narrative, either in a timeline or using flashback and flash forward to tell that story. Or it might follow that playlist philosophy of what's the vibe, what is the emotional ups and downs that you're providing readers. And the goal there would just be not, to stay static, monotone, right? So we might bring a little joy, make people a little sad, right? kind of coming up and down, so that you're finding the right experience for your readers. Something else you can think about as you're structuring your book is, are you presenting readers one continuous unit, kind of from start to finish? Boom, there's the table of contents, it goes in order. Or do you want to provide your readers multiple units? Perhaps you have some groupings of poems that work really well together and are doing interesting things. And so you might want to put those into individual sections, which is always an option for both a chapbook and a full-length collection. Some other elements you're going to want to start to think about as you begin to put your book together is your front matter and back matter. These are the pages that come before the table of contents and after the final poem in the book. You might have a title page where you let people know this is the title of the book, so this is different from the cover. It's that next page in. Having a table of contents that lets readers know what are all the poems and what pages do they appear on can be really helpful. That would be in your front matter. Back matter might include author notes, and that's where you can share any notes you want to provide. Maybe you use some resources to help inform you to be able to write some of your poems, especially if maybe they're historically based, or maybe you pulled in some song lyrics or some quotes from other writers, or you want to give credit to your best friend who took the picture that's going to be on your book cover. So you can share all of that information in notes, and you can also share in acknowledgments where you might thank people for their help in creating the book. Again, listing any publications that you've had. Maybe a poem that's appearing in the book was also published in a literary magazine and you want to give them credit for having published it first. Borrowed materials, cover art, all of that can go in the acknowledgments section as well. You might want to include an author biography. You might want to include a headshot. You might want to include a book blurb or a brief summary of what is your collection about. What you don't need yet at this stage of the game is an ISBN number. That is something that when your book is published by a publisher, or if you choose to go the route of self-publishing, that's an identification number that allows people to sell your book. And so that is a process that you would go through when you're about to put it into production for sale. So you don't need that as you're starting to put together your collection, if you're just going to kind of share it informally with people, or if you're going to be sending it to publishers. You also don't need to copyright your book yet. When you copyright you're sharing with the government that this is the collection that you have and you're paying a fee and you copyright it. But any revisions that you make don't fall underneath that copyright. And when you send your work to a publisher, they will be copyrighting your book when they get the ISBN number and when they put it out there for sale. So do your research if you're really interested in copyright laws, and make informed decisions about whether the expense of copywriting every single manuscript before it is formally copyrighted by the publisher, if that's best for you. And then endorsements, those blurbs on the back of the book that have people saying how awesome it is, that's something that you can wait on as well. That happens during the publication process, getting those endorsements. You don't have to have them on the front end when you're sharing your unpublished manuscript with potential publishers. So skills practice. While all of these examples are fresh, while you're excited, while things are buzzing in your brain, I'd like you to make a list. What's some of the books that I've shared that might be models for you? What are other books that you know that you love? Even if they're not poetry, that would be great inspiration for you. Write them down so you don't forget. What's your intention for your collection when you kind of think back on all the poems you've written in this course? What have you got going on? Might you be following a narrative path? Might you be following that emotional roller coaster path? What are some potential titles that popped into your head while we were talking about those? Cover images, different structures you could use, write them down. And also, what questions do you still have about the process? What do you need to find out to get excited and help you move forward? Looking ahead, we are going to be taking more time to pause and talk about how do you research ways that you can get your books published as well as individual poems. How do you find out what magazines would accept your work and all that jazz. We'll also be talking about how do you prepare your work to share with those different potential publishers and other stuff that comes up along the way. So I hope that you're getting excited. You start putting together your poems into smaller groups to send off to magazines and start thinking about how can you create a collection. If not this moment, at least in the near future with the work that you have accumulated so far. I hope that you're enjoying this journey and I can't wait to see what you create.